So having given that baseline, I'll move into what's new. One of the things, of course, is that with ISO being both passenger and freight transport, we needed to amend some of the terminology so that it wasn't just purely freight transport related, which means that references to things like logistics hubs on their own don't really work. And so we had to use more general terms like hubs, which would cover both logistics and railway stations and the like. We've also firmed up some of the terminology around data types to make sure that we refer consistently to primary data and two types of secondary data, namely modeling and defaults. And all that is to align with the terminology that is in other existing greenhouse gas standards within the ISO 14000 series. We also have slightly different terminology around the energy life cycle, where we refer to the emissions that relate to the provision of energy for use in a transport service, and then the operational emissions. And I'll explain that a little bit more. Within the development of ISO, we wanted to provide some example calculations. In practice, the ISO document became quite long and involved, and so actually what was agreed within that working group is that the practical examples would actually be provided within the GLEC framework. So we've expanded the section on practical examples in there so that the complementarity is firmed up. There are a couple of additional transport modes for the freight transport sector. Pipelines is by far the most relevant. We do also have reference to cable cars, but even in the passenger transport side, that's a bit of a peripheral mode in some way. And then there's also new guidance on emission factors, which is again something I'll pick up in a little while. Other things that are there, the emission factors that are already presented in ISO 14083. Even by the time you get to GLEC Framework 3, which was only published 6 months later, although the work for ISO 14083 is probably about 12 months old now on the emission factor side. Things move on all the time. It's quite a dynamic situation, particularly around the latest findings on higher emissions, particularly methane leakage at the point of fossil fuel or crude oil extraction or gas extraction, which have been found or observed by satellites to be much more than was previously anticipated. That feeds through into higher energy provision or well-to-tank emission factors. And also within the GLEC framework and supporting information, we're also continuing to look at a wider range of fuel options to support the energy transition, and that's something that I think will continue to expand in future versions of the GLEC framework. So the focus for both GLEC framework and ISO 14083 is a transport chain, basically going from the producer of goods or the consignor to the recipient or the consignee, which goes through various different transportation stages, both the actual transportation, but also the handling. Each of those becomes what is known as a transport chain element. And when calculating for a transport chain, it's necessary basically to calculate the emissions for each element and then add them together to get at the total chain. And then if you think about that from a corporate point of view, if you were to add up the emissions from all the trains or all the chains within the remit of a company, whether it's a service provider or a customer, you can basically get to the overall logistics emissions inventory that results from transport. And what's a key concept that I think it's important to take a minute or two on is the relationship between the transport chain and then the calculation that's performed at each of those elements, and the operations that occur by the vehicle or the vessels, or indeed the equipment at the hubs that go into that. We basically have set up the concept of a transport operation category for the transport legs, or a hub operation category for the hubs. And the idea is basically then, rather than focusing in on an individual movement, which is not necessarily going to be representative of the transport that occurs on a regular basis. The transport operation category represents movements generally of similar types of vehicles performing similar operations on a repeatable basis, so that actually the information that goes into the calculation for a transport chain element is more representative than an individual snapshot that might vary day by day, because generally that isn't particularly useful when it comes to aggregated emission reporting. If you want to look at one particular day, you can still do it within the rules of actually how you set up a transport operation category, but it's preferred to do it on a more aggregated basis. And within the GLEC framework, and indeed within the ISO, we set out some examples of what a transport operation category could be defined as, recognizing that, as I say, it tends to be the more aggregated ones that we would look for. And within there's some various other rules about making sure that you look at transport operations in a round trip basis to even out imbalances in flows, because a vehicle is only going to do a journey from A to B if it can also get back from B to A again. So it's important that we include any empty running, or in the case maybe of maritime containers, imbalances in trade between Asia and Europe, or Asia and North America and back. The boundaries of the emission calculation are again intended to be all-encompassing, all modes, taking into account, as I've said, the whole fuel life cycle, so the emissions from the energy production distribution, as well as those that come from the point of use. And that's really important when you think about the energy transition, because the balance between those two elements of the fuel cycle is changing significantly when you move from a predominantly fossil fueled transport sector through to one which is much more reliant on alternative fuels, or even electricity in the extreme case where the emissions are all upstream. And we also have the provision within both the GLEC framework and ISO to think about all gases that are considered within the UNFCCC or IPCC processes. Some of those are primarily to do with combustion emissions. Others are primarily to do with unintended release of refrigerants within the transport chain. But we need to make sure that they are all covered in one way or another. There's also interest in other short-lived climate pollutants, primarily black carbon. We've had a methodology annex for black carbon to the GLEC framework for 5 or 6 years now. Not embedded in the main document, but it's there as a backup for those who are interested. And again, the content of that now forms a non-compulsory informative annex to ISO 14083. And we're aware of interest again to potentially update that in the future. So those boundaries are basically the same as they have been for the GLEC framework for some time, but it's worth reiterating that. When you get to the GLEC framework and the new structure, it's basically split into 4 elements. The first focuses on calculation, use of emission results, backup data in the calculations, and then some further annexes, including a sector annex for the chemical industry. And I'll quickly run through some of the elements of that. Within the calculation, we run through basically the details of the various steps that you need to take, and then also that's where the detail of how the TOCs and the HOCs, those operation characteristics, are defined, and we also provide additional information for how to handle calculations within each mode, because for all the desire to standardize things as much as possible, there are always variations in terms of how modes are operated, and those nuances do require some particular specification or additional explanation. And again, that's a similar way of explaining things between the ISO and the GLEC framework. Generally, we always refer to the calculation being done in several steps. It's really important, firstly, to think about what data you need, where you're going to get it from, particularly if you're a purchaser of transport services, how you're going to interact with your service providers to get the best inputs as possible. It is possible potentially that you might be able to get their primary data, but it's more likely that if you're going to get information like that, it would be the result of calculations performed by the transport operator using their primary data to be passed through to you. And if you also operate your own services, then also look at actually what primary data you have in order to come to the full set of information. Pull that all together in terms of calculating your total greenhouse gas emissions expressed in terms of the mass of CO2 equivalent. And then also think about actually expressing that in terms of an intensity. For a transport operator, the intensity would generally be expressed in terms of emissions per ton kilometer. There are other divisors allowed, maybe for maritime containers, for example, you might go with TU kilometers. Post, you might go per item. What's appropriate for an end user might vary slightly, because you might also want to express that purely in terms of tons of product or number of items, number of vehicles produced for an automaker, etc. But the combination of both the total emissions and the emission intensity in whichever metric is really important to understand actually how you track emissions over time, because we all want to reduce total emissions, because that's what has the climate impact. But that the emission intensity also is a good indication of whether or not you're being more efficient in times where transport demand is still going up. So the combination is really important. Checking the calculation is really what the assurance is about. So I'm going to skip over that for now, leave that to Anna. And then the emission reporting is really important in terms of the content, standardizing the content, and also where you spread that out to. Early in the process, I mentioned terminology about the energy life cycle. And I think probably many people are used to the middle set of terms there, the well to tank and the tank to wheel terminology. And that really corresponds to what we now refer to in the ISO 14083, energy provision emissions and operational emissions. We've moved away from of well to tank, because we're also anticipating the move away from a purely fossil fuel fueled transport sector, and that terminology is consistent with the other ISO standards, and it's also consistent wherever you are within the supply chain. So an energy provision emission is the same whether or not you're the carrier, whether you're a logistics service provider, whether you're a shipper customer. it has that same designation. And that is one area that differs from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, because the terminology there with the scopes, that does vary depending on your role within the supply chain. And so what's shown here is just a little bit of sort of mapping as to how you would go about maybe reporting under one, reporting under another, and what the relationship is between the two. Another element which is expressed more explicitly within the ISO and then brought through primarily in the worked examples of the new GLEC framework is refrigerant emissions, making sure that although they may be released in small amounts through system leakages around air conditioning, temperature control systems, that wherever possible, that information is captured, because those gases, they have an enormously high global warming potential, and it's very important that that is captured so that we can identify where weak points in the system are, and they can be addressed. And the impact of that is also then fed through into the calculations and the tracking. There can be a little bit of a disconnect there, because the data tends to be captured at refill, which tends to happen within hubs, whether it's a maintenance point or at a maritime container hub, whereas in practice the leakage happens and is related to the transportation. So again, data sharing within the supply chain becomes very important. That's probably an area that still needs to get more mature than it is now, but nonetheless, it's an important aspect that should be included. Just thinking then about using the emission results, because none of this calculation and reporting is done just for its own sake. You're reporting really to a balance of both internal stakeholders, your management, your operational staff. It's important that your salespeople, your procurement people understand actually the emission impact of what you're doing, because increasingly it's going to be an element of doing business, understanding actually what your emissions are. And I think the reason it becomes part of doing business comes back to those external pressures and that I was talking about at the start. Shareholders, investors are increasingly setting up their own frameworks that are looking to hold companies to account. Customers are increasingly doing so. Governments as well. I haven't really made reference to countemissions.eu in this presentation, because we've talked about that recently elsewhere, but it's a very good example, as are the CSRD regulations, of how regulators are looking at this area. And then there's an increasing number also of emission labels and the like cropping up as well. So really important to take this on board, but also important for us again to continue that process of embedding the same approach wherever possible into all these different activities, so that you only need to do things once. The reporting requirements within ISO 14083 are largely split into two. You've got the organizational level reporting, where basically you add up your emissions for the organization as a whole, so adding up all the transport chains that you're responsible for, putting that into your emissions inventory as explicit values for the logistics sector, so that it can be identified, and making sure that that covers both total emissions and intensities, and breaking that out by mode as well, but also having that information available at the service level for communication between the different organizations in the supply chain. This would really probably be supporting those bilateral, potentially confidential exchanges of information that are going to become more and more important between service providers and their customers, to ensure that information does flow through the chain. And at the service level, we do request that the operational emissions are split out from the total, so that you can understand actually what the balance of the two is. And what we've done then is think back to in the previous version of the GLEC framework, we had something called the GLEC declaration, which was again intended to support the communication between supply chain partners, and thinking about the difference that's there between the previous version of the GLEC declaration and the ISO reporting. The key difference is that whereas previously we would just have asked for the total emissions, or the well to, expressed under the well to wheel name, now that would need to be split out to show both the tank to wheel and the well to wheel values for greater transparency. Everything else would basically remain the same. I just wanted to then highlight, as I said previously, within section 3 module 4 of the GLEC framework, we have quite a few worked examples that are intended to provide more concrete information about how to do some calculations in the individual modes, just to make it more concrete and understandable. We also have a particular annex for the chemical sector in section 4. It's something that we produced actually back in 2021. We've updated it with some of the newer emission factors, the additional knowledge, but that also contains further worked examples as well, which might be interesting even to people who aren't purely interested in the chemical sector. And then looking ahead, in terms of future developments, I've called this informed speculation. It's a little bit of a personal view, but it's based on some of the things that I'm picking up. For example, within the ISO working group, we had some questions why, if we were doing fuel life cycle, we weren't also including vehicle life cycle. And I think there were two answers to that. One was, within ISO, it's perceived that the vehicle life cycle is already covered to a certain extent by one of the other standards, which looks at a product life cycle calculation. And it was felt that if we went there at this stage, we would be duplicating that, but also that we didn't necessarily have a finished methodology that we could slot into the ISO standard. The other aspect then is that may well come in the future, because there are ongoing projects, so it might be something that might fit into the next phase. Within the GLEC framework, we know that our Chinese colleagues are very keen to have some China specific content within the main version. We've previously translated our previous versions into Chinese, but I think they will be coming with China-specific emission intensities before long as well. I've already mentioned the CEFIC chemical industry guidelines, but we've also been working on specific guidelines for the RoRo sector. Those are for the now published only through Industry Association and SFC, but it's built on concept within ISO 14083 out of the idea of passenger equivalents, which were developed for ferries which carry both passengers and freight. So it's an indication of how these things can develop and lead. One methodology then knocks into developments in a different place. And we anticipate that there may well be further sector guidelines. We did have a mail and parcel guideline in version 2 of the GLEC framework. That's a little bit dated, so we've stripped that back a bit, put it in a different place, but no, we can see that an update to that may well come back in a future version, and I'm sure there are other sectors where that would be benefiting as well. I also then wanted to pick up again on the emission factors, just to give a little bit of a view as to what the new emission factors that are within the GLEC framework look like. The presentation of them follows the format of ISO 14083. It's more detailed than what we've had previously. We make sure that we follow the methodology for emission factors that's set out in ISO 14083. So that would, in theory, include the development of infrastructure for the energy provision, just to make sure that as wind turbines and solar panels and the like are produced, we don't overlook the fact that there is some economic activity and embedded emissions, even within renewable electricity, that needs to be taken into account. Full details of some of these different fuel categories and how they relate to the likes of the Renewable Energy Directive would be contained within the GLEC framework. And I think one thing is that emission factors are dynamic. There's still new knowledge coming through. The IPCC recently released a new set of global warming potentials in their sixth assessment report, which means that emission factors then that contain methane, nitrous oxide, etc., need to have their impact updated. And it's a marginal impact, but you do see it, and it's important to keep up to date. One other thing is that as the energy transition progresses, you're likely to see lower emission electricity being used to power fuel production, which means that that should feed through to lower energy provision emission factors, or to put it another way, the well to tank element should drop, and so that should feed through. And it may well be that there'll be geographic variations between some locations that progress more quickly to low emission electricity than others. And something that's really needed is more transparency over the methodology, and hopefully some harmonization of those emission factors. That's something that lies behind a task that was within the European Commission's Horizon Work Programme. There was a task for which proposals closed about 3 weeks ago now, and the aim is really to pull together a group of organizations working on emission factors and the ecosystem around them, so the production and the assurance of emission factors, the organizations that are feeding into that, so fuel producers, all come together in order to improve and harmonize the methodology. And someone or a consortium will be doing that from around Q2 2024. And then finally, all this basically comes back to SFC's mission, which is around improving transparency and driving a transition in terms of greenhouse gas emissions within the freight transport sector. We already, with our members, are involved in emission tracking. We don't really need to look too much at the detail of that. It's something that we're continually looking to improve. But what's really important is that people need to be prepared for more of this, not just from us, but more from other stakeholders as well who are interested in declarations of emissions, the Commission and other regulators wanting to know more. So we're anticipating that there will be a lot more work in that area going forward. And so it's really important for companies to, if they haven't started on a journey of calculating and reporting, that they pick up the existing standards and progress in that line. We can offer through various elements. We make the GLEC framework in its latest version available for free. We provide trainings. There are guidelines around specific elements. We work to accredit calculation tools and programs to make sure that they follow the GLEC framework, and we offer the GLEC partnership alongside other membership or as part of other membership organizations for SFC. So we really look to collaborate with as many different people and organizations as we can. and really all of that comes back again to providing confidence and consistency in the calculations that are performed. That's the role of assurance, picking out and making sure that different elements are done correctly. And that's really what Anna will be talking about very shortly. So I'm not going to say more than that now. So time for me to grab a glass of water and give my voice a rest.
Not yet,
Yes.
Alan. We're gonna ask you a lot of questions. There were several questions in the chat. In the
Okay.
meantime, I've agreed with Catherine that she will ask you the questions, that she might be better understand the questions a little bit better. Just as an informal or formal announcement, I don't think we'll have time to go into depth into each question. So if you at the end of the session feel that your question was not replied on sufficiently, I think you can all mail Catherine or Pablo and ask your question, and we'll see to it that you at least get some form of answer. So with this, Catherine, go ahead with the questions you selected for Alan.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Maybe to start with one of the first ones that were asked, that was around hub operations. So, for instance, if there is emissions around a loading process, unloading processes in a warehouse, would that then typically fall under these hub operations emissions?
Yes. Simple
Very
answer on that
simple.
one.
Simple. I think that goes maybe also in a similar direction than another one that we found in there, because there's let me just check where I spotted that primary data. No, that was not the case. There was one. Yes, that one. That might be even a bit linked to that one. Some try to get away with some scope 3 emissions by excluding emissions they are not responsible for, just because there are different Incoterms and downstream transport. That would be, so there's also a question what would be a good answer around that. And if you may allow me, and Ellen, you can just then add on to my response to that, because I know that from a former discussion that we have with one of our member companies, that there is also something that is around, you've heard today, and Ellen mentioned that the GLEC framework as well as ISO is built on the GH3 protocol principles. And according to the GH3 protocol principles, there's kind of different approaches how to report scope 3 emissions. And the one that is most well accessible and usable for logistics is actually the control approach. There's a financial control approach. So if scope 3 emissions are under your financial control, but the other one that is more likely to be used is the operational control, meaning that the definition of whatever is under a company's operational control should be reported under the scope 3 emissions independently, now directly independently from the Incoterms as such, but that is the approach that GH3 protocol is taking. So maybe that's the best guidance on how to actually do that, what the GH3 protocol actually says about that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You've got within Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3, you've got the Category 4, which is basically your directly contracted and inbound transport. But even if you've got outbound transport which is not contracted by you, you're still expected to, within a supply chain, to report that to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And therefore, given that we have built on Greenhouse Gas Protocol badge for the GLEC framework, that would be part of the boundary. And whatever your Incoterms might say, you still should be trying to do your best to calculate that. It may be a more approximate calculation if you're struggling to get the data, but you should still be able to understand roughly where those goods are going and to be able to use a default.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Then there is something there is some parts that there's a lot of questions actually, so I do believe we cannot run through all of them. There is one interesting one that I would just pick because it's not directly linked to ISO or GLEC framework, but it's a very hot topic right now. Is insetting and book and claim accepted under ISO 14083 and the GLEC framework?
The answer to that the answer to that is long, unfortunately. For the ISO, it's quite simple in the sense that the ISO neither includes nor excludes it. The ISO specifically excludes offsetting, but you have to remember that the ISO process was a long process, a detailed process, and we had a lot of the content was actually reasonably set in stone by the middle of 2021, and then you go through various iterations. At Smart Freight Centre, we've been developing a framework for transport insetting, which was published earlier this year, but there was no way that we could then get that into the ISO. So we've made sure that it neither rules it in nor rules it out. We're then in a situation where we know that the greenhouse gas protocol definitely at the moment does not accept insetting or book and claim. At Smart Freight Centre, working with our members, we know that it's a really important mechanism to get decarbonisation to happen through the energy transition within the transport sector. So we are taking as much of an effort as we can to say, look, here that there is an approach for book and claim and insetting, which would align with the principles of the GLEC framework, ISO 14083, and indeed the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for transport, and say, if you want transport to be able to decarbonise at its fastest rate, this should be allowed. But it's a process that is really managed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, not by us or ISO. And so we're subject to then being a consultee ourselves and someone that inputs into that process. But we want it to be, and we believe we've got the solution for it to be.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Maybe one more before we actually go into the presentation of the assurance part from Anna. According our accreditation partners, and I can maybe also answer that one. So there's listed accreditation partners that are accredited against the GLEC Framework version 2 for now. And now, as last week, the GLEC Framework version 3 has been published. We have also, all the accredited partners have also been informed about that, and this is now an ongoing process. They now know what the new things are, what they have to maybe build into their technical methodology and their tools. So they get a certain period of time to include these changes, and we have an annual renewal process for our accreditations. And we're also looking currently into revising that to also make the accreditation against the ISO standard. So that will all be part of an ongoing transition right now until we have the annual renewal. We would expect the tool providers to update their methodology where needed to the latest version of the GLEC framework.
And it shouldn't be too fundamental a change because the underlying principles are the same.
Exactly. Maybe one that I can maybe take a bit into that conversation and take into that Anna can lead in the assurance process, because there's also a question how we can ensure that, for instance, if primary data is shared by a partner company, how they can be assured or verified that that is actually correct, of good quality or whatever. So maybe that leads nicely into your presentation and into the scheme. So maybe you can just keep that a bit in mind when you're now presenting your slides and maybe reply that within that go.